Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeremy Collins, the Director of Conferences and Symposia here at the National World War II Museum. We've got a great program for you today featuring Dr. John Morrow and Dr. Rob Citino. Dr. Citino will be leading the conversation with Dr. Morrow. Rob is our senior historian here at the National World War II Museum, as well as our executive director for the Institute of the Study of War and Democracy. And Rob, we would love for you to take the show over, and ladies and gentlemen, make sure you type in any questions you have so that we can make sure Dr. Morrow or Dr. Citino gets to them. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. I live for the moment when I get to take the program over. John, it's wonderful to be here with you today. Let me, there's an old phrase that John Morrow needs no introduction, and you usually reserve that for people who deserve a very big introduction indeed. Let me give a brief version of that to our listeners, John. Dr. John H. Morrow Jr., a wonderful friend of the National World War II Museum. He's the convener of the museum's presidential counselors. He's the Franklin Professor and Chair of the History Department at the University of Georgia in Athens, where he teaches courses on the history of modern Europe, warfare, and society. He's contributed to the education of faculty and students at the National War College, the Air War College, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He's chaired the History Advisory Committee to the Secretary of the Air Force, as well as the Research Advisory Committee of the National Museum of American History, and served on the History Advisory Committee of the Department of the Army, John, something we share. I'm currently the chair of that august body, and it goes on. The work continues.
Very good.
Most recently, and I just a capper in the introduction, John was the 13th recipient of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library Literature Award for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing. And I think when we heard that announcement, John, there were many of us in the field who slapped high fives in your honor. It could not have gone to a more deserving individual. So welcome to the National World War II Museum's program today.
Thanks very much, Rob. It's a pleasure to be with you and with all the guests of the museum. I appreciate your doing high fives. I was doing high fives to myself.
Oh, I'm sure you are.
Looking at the prize money and thinking, oh, I'll be rich for 1 year and then back to penury. So
I think now we have a virtual form of high fiving. I'm certain that
literally.
We have an interesting program today. The title, for those of you who heard it, is Eugene Bullard, Hero of Two World Wars. But I will say the story has a bit of a twist and twists and turns, we might say, John. Let me begin. The story of Eugene Bullard, to me, as I was reading it, is a kind of an American epic. He's born in 1894, youngest son of 10 children, African-American father, Creek Indian mother, grew up in Columbus, Georgia. How would you evaluate, John, young Eugene's prospects in that situation, in that time and place? What did he have to look forward to growing up in Columbus, Georgia?
To be perfectly candid, Rob, for a young Black boy growing up in Columbus, Georgia at that time, his prospects were most likely limited to becoming a dock worker, which is what his father, who was a very large man, some 6'5", 250 pounds, Bullard was not, or to work on cotton. They still called them plantations in those days, picking cotton, or doing odd jobs. But as someone said, commenting a little later, who lived in Columbus, if you got an education, it opened all the doors for a Black man, the back door, the barn door, various other doors, but never the front door. So I think we have to say that for this young man growing up, the prospects were very limited, and that's what makes his story so incredible. It's actually better than fiction, because given those limited expectations, one could never have expected that this little boy from Columbus was going to evolve into, as the title says, a hero of two world wars, and even more interestingly, a celebrated hero of the French Army and the French Air Service. So truth is stranger than fiction.
You've given away the twist of the story right up front there.
It's interesting to give that away immediately because it is such an amazing story. I was drawn to it initially when I ran across him way back in the 80s when I was doing research in France in the French archives on French aviation. I thought, whoa, wait a minute here. This is someone I missed completely, and backed up and thought, what an amazing story. There should be a movie on it, but I'm not pushing that. I don't write scripts.
By the end of this program, maybe we'll have that script kind of outlined. So at the age of 10, Eugene had already run away from home, maybe more than once. And at the ripe old age of 12, he actually stows aboard a merchant freighter. I have to ask, John, how does this come about? I mentioned to you before the program began, at the age of 10, I was watching the Flintstones. And I don't hesitate to say probably a lot of 10-year-old kids are doing just that. Eugene obviously had some vision of himself as outside of the sort of standard, barn door, back door mode that you just outlined. How does that come about? Talk to us.
I think Eugene Bullard strikes me as from a very early age. He seems to have always had a very pleasant personality. He got along well with people, but he also had a fiery temper, a flash, especially about racial issues as he got older. And his father, who was known as Big Chief Ox because of the mixture of Native American and African blood, had gotten in trouble one day down on the docks where he worked because the agent, not the man he worked for, Bradley, was very good, but his immediate boss just kept bothering him, and one day hit him in the head from behind with a baling hook and scarred him. And it didn't put the big man down, it just made him angry. And he picked the foreman up and threw him down 3 floors through a grain elevator. They thought he was dead. It probably broke every bone in his body. But the thing is that when his father came home that night, he said there are going to be problems. And he basically closed the door. And this is in 1904. The mother had died in 1902. And they sat there, and sure enough, these drunken men gathered from the town and come out to lynch him. Well, they don't realize that Bullard's father's sitting behind the door with a loaded shotgun. But they all hid and very quietly did nothing. And so when they went away, I think that was probably about the time when Bullard decided, because he was already encountering issues with white people in Columbus, that he wanted to leave. And so what you see is that starting, as you said, at the age of 10, he has this vision. One of the things, because there's clearly a family background, a French family background in the family that owned the Bullard's father. And he certainly would talk about France as this place where, people could be free regardless of their color. And that seems to have stuck in the minds of this young fellow who really, how do you describe it? I guess when you get an idée fixe, an idea fixed in your mind at that young age, he had only gotten about 2 years worth of school, so he could read and write and do figures, but he undoubtedly had no idea in hell where France was. And so he's going to get there, and he tries to run away at 10, 11, and he finally makes a break for it at 12, and his father can't capture him. And he goes all around the South. He lives with gypsies. He becomes a jockey, and he's a good rider. He works with horses. He seems to be an intrepid youth. I mean, he could do anything. He works stables. He'll work in stores and so on. But he works his way around the South. Actually managed to make it to Pensacola, delivering a horse once, and he sees the ocean. And then that reminds him, but that's not the ocean, it's the Gulf of Mexico. But he thinks, that's an ocean. I need to cross an ocean to get to France. And so gradually he's worked his way up and back out of Atlanta, and finally comes up to Atlanta. And he has a better sense that he has to go someplace on the eastern seaboard. So he heads for Virginia, riding on trains, under the cars, on on the racks under the cars, and he gets to Virginia, Richmond, and then he gets to Hampton Road, Virginia Beach, and he gets a ship. He thinks, I'm going to make it. And unfortunately, the ship only goes to Newport News, and he gets off. He thinks, I've made it. And the kid on the dock says, he says, where am I? He said, you're in Newport News, Virginia, dummy. So he signs on. He waits and he sees this German ship, and he does all this work, the Martha Russe. He does all this work for these men. And then he stows away. And when they find him, they've already left port. And he's on his way to Europe. And he's going to learn a little bit of German, which will come in handy. But he does odd jobs around the ship, and they accept him perfectly well. And when they let him off in Aberdeen, Scotland, he knows he's a lot closer to France than he'd been before.
So he's not in France yet, but I guess every journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single stop, Newport News, and then Aberdeen, Scotland. Yeah. When he arrives in England, he kind of carves out a bit of in the United Kingdom, I should say, kind of carves out a bit of a career for himself there, doesn't he? Tell us about Eugene Bullard, prize fighter, which is, I guess, the next stage of this young man's career.
Yeah, you think, all right, he's now in England. He lands in Aberdeen, and it's just sort of amazing to trace his steps from Aberdeen, Scotland, where he can't really understand Scots English because the R's roll too much. Then he catches a train later on, after he works on the docks, to Liverpool, and he finds that there is a Black community there, and Liverpool had been a big trading and slave trading operation in the city, and so he actually finds Black people there, and then he keeps heading on, and from Liverpool he ends up in London, and on the way he meets, because there are all these Black expatriates already there, there's a substantial community of Black boxers, dancers, performers. There are these various minstrel troops that operate out of England to travel around the continent, because when he gets there in the 19 teens, early in 1908 even, there's talk about this African Black craze where everybody wants Black performers. So he's a solid fellow, probably about 5'9", 5'10", about 160 pounds. We've seen pictures of him as a boxer. He's not big and bulky. He's a welterweight. And he catches on with this boxer and his troupe, and he learns very quickly. And so he ends up being a welterweight in the boxing troupe, and they get to travel all over the place. He also picks up some additional funds, being a dancer and a performer in some of these shows. So they're going to get him to Europe. He actually visits St. Petersburg, goes all over the continent, and then finally he gets to France, because the boxing troupe goes to France, and by that time what's called Le Boxe Anglaise or Le Boxe Américaine has taken over from French boxing, which was basically looks like martial arts today, where you're just kicking and beating on people. So he gets to France. He can do shows as a performer. He's going to learn to be a jazz drummer. He can box. He earns enough money to buy himself a small apartment in Montmartre, which is up the hill just below the Sacré-Cœur, which is a beautiful white basilica on top of the hill overlooking Paris. And that's where all what we would call nowadays the beatniks, but the artsy crowd, the artists are there.
Bohemians.
The Bohemians. And it's just a marvelous scene. My father stayed there in the 40s and 50s when he was doing his doctorate in France and working, studying at the Sorbonne. And it was still the same way in the 40s and 50s with the second generation of African-American, African expatriates who all settled there. So he's living the good life by 1913, early 14. He's in France, and he's perfectly happy. He can get boxing bouts when he wants.
This is a historically aware audience. So when you say 1913, everybody knows what's right around the corner. Very eve of World War I, John. Eugene is an American citizen, but he wants to do his duty for the Republic, that being the French Republic. Tell us about his time in the French Foreign Legion. The story, just as you put it, it's better than fiction.
Yes. At that time, when the war begins, there are a substantial number of young Americans, black and white. A number of the white youth are very wealthy and highly educated from elite universities, Harvard, Yale, the Ivy League, and some of them are in France painting. Others of them decide, oh, wait a minute, this is a war against German autocracy, against French egalitarianism and freedom, and we're going to fight for France. And so they start joining, but you can't join the French army. Now, you also have to remember this time, you didn't need a passport to travel from country to country before World War I. That happens afterward. So he had gotten, obviously, to France with no passport or anything else. Says, well, what do I do next? And it turns out the French Foreign Legion is recruiting. Well, you don't want to join the French Foreign Legion, seriously, at any point in time. That's a bunch of what we call tough hombres, and their training is brutal. And the normal enlistment period is 5 years. Well, the French Foreign Legion makes allowances for all these foreigners who want to join. So they say, okay, fine, we're going to create marching regiments, which will be there for the duration of the conflict. So Eugene manages to be in this second group of Americans who sign up, and he's perfect for the French Foreign Legion. He's a good size at that time. He's strong, he's fit, and he trains. And they say, well, you're in such good condition, we're going to give you a heavy machine gun to haul around, and with 2 men for your crew.
Always an honor.
Yeah, the machine guns of the time, the Hotchkiss and the Saint Etienne, weighed anywhere from usually about 52 to 57 pounds, and that's without all the gear. So they figured this character is going to be a benefit to the Foreign Legion. So off he goes to the front. And in those years, let's just put it this way, this is a good way to die, because the notion of combat is you come charging out of the trenches straight into machine gun fire. It doesn't care. Cover? To hell with cover. You don't need cover. Bullets are going to hit you. If you die, you die. And so he's actually going to fight really on what will be known as the Somme front later. He'll serve in Artois in 1915 in the battles there. And talk about brutal. In the charges, he has a carbine. He carries a carbine. And then when it comes time, because there's always going to be a counterattack, when the Germans counterattack, he mans the machine gun and just guns them down. And that disturbs him somewhat. He can see the blood spurting out of their bodies, but the point is, this is kill or be killed. It's hand-to-hand combat frequently. And he receives his first wound in the Artois when a shell splinter cuts his right eyebrow, bleeds all over him, but nobody pays any attention to that. It's a minor wound. But he manages to survive that. And at the same time, the 3rd Marching Regiment is being literally decimated. The company starts with 250 men on one particular day. At the end of a day of combat, it's down to 53. And so you're lucky if you're still standing. So he sees his friends all around him being killed. And in the end, what's going to happen is that the regiment doesn't really exist anymore, and it'll have to be disbanded. And he will end up in what's called the 170th Regiment, which oddly enough is it's a coincidence. A lady at a boarding house in Georgia had said that he was a swallow. I don't know why she said that, but she said, you're a swallow and you're bound to fly. And it just so happens the 170th Regiment is entitled, because they all have these titles, Les Hirondelles de la Mort, the swallows of death. And it's perfect for Bullard because he becomes L'Hirondelle Noire, which is the black swallow of death. So he takes right onto that. And, you know, he's one of the gang. And I think one of the interesting things to note with these men who serve, some of his friends are black, another box by the name of Bob Scanlon, but he serves with a large number of young Americans from both North and South, and there aren't any racial problems because everybody's even up. He's going to be a corporal already because he served as a machine gunner. And it just so happens that he may have survived the Artois, but the fun is just beginning.
So from the infantry, he'll fight, I believe, at Verdun. I think he'll be wounded again. He joins the I guess the Nation French Air Service, the Aéronautique Militaire, in 1916. Is this a case of I've had enough trench warfare? Put me above it all?
No, Eugene Bullard doesn't ever seem to get enough of fighting something. What happens is that he serves in the cauldron of Verdun. And anyone who's read anything about World War I knows that the battles of Verdun in the summer in 1916 are cataclysmic. They're horrific. And at Verdun, he gets wounded twice more. But this time, the first wound smashes, a shell fragment smashes into the right side of his face and literally takes out all of his teeth, leaving him with relatively few. And what they do, because in the middle of combat, they simply stitch him up. And of course, the face is getting larger and larger, and he's in agony. That doesn't make any difference. He continues his job. He's a runner, moving through the shell fire. And 2 days later, he's running a message back and forth when he gets blown into the side of the trench by another shell. But this one rips a tear in his thigh. It's going to take 90 stitches to clear up. And he's lucky it misses the femoral artery. It could have killed him. So at that point in time, they say, when they get him back, they say, well, it looks like your infantry career is done. There's not enough of you to piece together anymore. So they send him back to Lyon, to what's called the Hotel Dieu there, with the hospital. And he's lucky because there's a sanitarium there and he gets the most wonderful treatment. They actually repair his face. And when you see him in later years, you can't tell he's had all his teeth. They've replaced the teeth. They've taken out the broken shards and his face looks quite normal. And they've stitched him up. He hobbles around town on crutches. And when he's there, he meets the equivalent of a major in the French Air Service, Ferrolino. And Ferrolino notes, he says, you can't serve in the army anymore, infantry. He said, but a lot of former soldiers join the French Air Service if they can't serve. He said, you'd still be fit to serve in the Air Service, and you could be a machine gunner in these old biplanes where you've got a rear gunner behind the pilot. He's perfect. He's been handling a machine gun. And Bullard says, that's a really good idea. And Ferrolino helps him get in, but he takes it one step further in the sense that he's offered to be a machine gunner, but he has a couple of friends in Paris. At this point in time, when he's away from the front, he can go visit Paris. He goes to Paris, and one of these guys says, yeah, you're going to join the Air Service, but you can't be a pilot. And Bullard says, why not? He says, because you're black. And this is a Southern fellow. He's a good friend of his. And Bullard says, I don't believe that I can be a pilot. And a couple of his other friends who happen to be wealthy, white friends, say, yeah, he can be a pilot. Let's take a bet. Let's do a bet on this. And they bet the fellow $2,000. that Bullard can become a pilot.
A sizable amount of money for the day.
Yes, at that time he'll be wealthy. And so off Bullard goes and asks the colonel, can I be transferred into pilot's training? And they transfer him in. And so it's going to take pilot's training. It's very dangerous. There are more men killed in training, actually even in World War II, than there are in combat. But in World War I, the numbers are ferocious. You learn how to fly by driving a penguin across a field, which is a plane with no wings. And you have this nitwit, these guys just running, they call them buzzards as well. The men are called buzzards. They're running back and forth across the field at top speed. Things are turning over and so on. And then when you fly, they don't have dual training. You go up by yourself, you come down by yourself, then you have to do a distance flight. Bullard does all this in normal time, 6 or 7 months, and then is commissioned a fighter pilot. He'll serve in 2 different French squadrons, N-93 and N-95. But being a pilot makes you one of the elite. And I think one of the things that's worth it to note, when he's in training, he's bunking in with about 5 or 6 other young Americans, one of whom is James Norman Hall, the author of Mutiny on Bounty, who had been a reporter for Atlantic Monthly. And James Norman Hall actually leaves an account of the guys in this room, and he refers to Bullard as quite lengthy. He said, yeah, we got a couple of Princetonians from the South. We can understand Bullard better than we can understand them, because they speak Southern, so to speak. And then he says, he refers to Bullard as our black brother. Then occasionally he says, nah, he's actually whiter than some of the white guys. So, you know, he's been completely accepted. But what Hall notes is, he says, this guy has been decorated for valor numerous times. He speaks French and we don't. And so he can get all kinds of corporal. He can get us all kinds of things that we couldn't do for ourselves. So he's actually one of the guys. And he goes on. And the thing is that every place he goes, every stop he makes, Legion, Air, he makes friends. These guys become friends for life. This is sort of loyalty, an incredible bond among them. And he goes off to fly and will be flying the latest France has to offer, the French Spad, which is built like a brick, unlike most planes of the time, but it's fast, it's powerful. And unfortunately, his career is going to be relatively short because he has a problem. There aren't going to be, and this is 1917 now, and the United States is in war, there will be no black aviators in the U.S. Air Service.
I was about to ask that. How unique is Eugene Bullard?
Yeah. So he's already in what's called the Lafayette Flying Corps. Any man who serves in the French Air Service, any American becomes a member of the Lafayette Flying Corps, as distinct from the Lafayette Escadrille, which is the squadron, fighter squadron. He's automatically a member of the Lafayette Flying Corps. But the man who is responsible for paying them and sort of organizing is a doctor who runs the American hospital at Neuilly by the name of Edmund Gross. And Gross is a ferocious racist. He wants nothing to do with Bullard. He can't stop Bullard, at least momentarily, but he refuses to acknowledge Bullard. He refuses to pay him, except at the very end. He makes him wait until everyone else has been paid, and then he pays it. And Gross really does not want him in the air at all. And this is going to accord somewhat with the Americans, because the least they can't tolerate, with no African Americans in the air service, how can you have this fellow right next door in a SPAD squadron flying the latest planes, He's an African American. He's in the French Air Service. You can't have this. And so he flies some 25 missions, is in the Air Service for a total of 3 or 4 months. He accounts for 2 probables. It was hard to verify planes in World War I because you're fighting usually on the offensive, on the other side of the lines. But he's pretty certain he shot down a Fokker triplane. But the only trouble is, if you can't verify seeing it crash, or no one else can see it crash, you can never be sure, because if you're hit and you're a German pilot and you're over Germany, you spiral down and it looks like you're hit. You spiral out of the combat and then crash. So we'll never know. But when he shoots, he thinks the one down, he gets shot down himself, at least in the French lines, and manages to get out. But he's removed after an altercation. Altercations are pretty normal in those years. The French pilot, the ace pilot who adopted him, sort of, Jean Navarre, is a nut who actually have psychological problems, but he also has a racing car that they drive into Montmartre every night, all these pilots, and they raise holy hell and get back to the airfield in time the next morning to fly a mission. And Navarre was actually finally put away in a sanatorium because he had run over 3 French policemen with his racing car.
I think the third one was the charm, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think so. I think the third one took him out. So Bullard, after this altercation, which should have meant nothing, because I said, these guys are getting in fights all the time, suddenly learns that he is removed from the French Air Service. Now he's just barely getting into his stride, but it turns out that Edmund Gross, this bête noire, the man who will cause his problems, has used this as an excuse, along with the U.S. Air Service, because we're pretty certain of the background of the documents, to get him removed from the French Air Service altogether. He will be sent back to the 170th Infantry Regiment. He can no longer serve on the line, so he gets stuck away in a rear area pushing papers until the end of the war, when he will be discharged April 1919. But he is a legitimate French hero. Americans don't know much about him, but by God, the French know who Jacques Bullard is.
So he's removed from his love now of being a pilot, really at the instigation of the U.S. military, for whom this is just unacceptable that a black pilot be flying when we won't even allow that here. So he's French now. He doesn't say, well, I'm going home, the war is over, I'm going back to Columbus, Georgia. Where does he spend the interwar period, John, if you could just kind of flesh that out for us in some broad strokes?
Very good, yeah. Some people probably have heard that famous American song of World War I, how you're going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris. That goes doubly so for African Americans. If you got out and you've been in France, you've lived in France, you're accepted. He speaks French, and I think your point is really well taken. Yeah, he's going to end up being practically more French than he is American. He has a number of American friends, both black and white. He's going to, this is actually going to be the time, what they call Paris Noir, Black Paris, in which Montmartre, the clubs are filled with African-American performers. Everybody wants African-American performers. People will know Josephine Baker from that time. There's another one, Amanda Smith, who's known as Bricktop because she has red hair, is a very famous singer. But Bullard is in the center of all this swirl. He comes out of the French Air Service. The $2,000 seems to have disappeared pretty quickly. He probably
will happen.
I think they partied it all. but he also probably used it to get this very nice apartment in Montmartre. And he proceeds to be, in a sense, the key figure in the formation, first of a club that's formed by a fellow Joe Zelli, who is a big entrepreneur, the Club Zelli in Paris. And he's the man who sort of is the impresario. He brings in the acts. He secures African-American performers like Bricktop and brings them over. And as well, he can recruit bands. One of the members of the bands that will be there later, actually the band leader, is a fellow by the name of Arthur Dooley Wilson. And anyone, I hope of my generation, who remembers the famous movie Casablanca, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, remembers Dooley Wilson as Sam, the pianist who's going to play. And the thing is that the irony, of course, is that Dooley Wilson didn't play the piano. He sang. So somebody else played the piano. Well, he pretended to play it, but he had a band there. He met Louis Armstrong. He knew Louis Armstrong very well. Anyone who was anybody, and the people who frequented, he's first an impresario, then he owns his own club, Le Grand Duc, and then after that, he's going to own another club, which he entitles Escadrille, Squadron, and he's going to run a gym and a massage parlor attached to the gym. He's got all these businesses going. He's doing very well. He marries a French woman. They have 2 daughters.
Question in the box
They will, yeah.
That was a question in the box, so thanks for answering.
Yeah, they actually, there were rumors that she was a French countess. Sometimes people are prone to exaggeration. No, her family was well-to-do grocers. She will have a home in Biarritz, but they basically went their separate ways because he was very preoccupied with his enterprises. They will divorce in 1935, and the girls will be left. He'll raise the girls. But the thing is that the 20s literally are roaring in Paris, and it is where anyone who is Black wants to be. You'll recognize the names. Langston Hughes, the famous poet, was actually a busboy in Bullard's club, his cabaret. There'll also be these instances, and I think this is the downside of it. Things are going very well, but Americans, especially white Southerners who come to France in the 20s, have a very difficult time because here you see all these African-American and Africans with French women, no problems, and Southerners, white Southerners cannot abide this. And so the biggest issues often come from these. He doesn't have problems with the men who served, Southern or Northern, but these people who come to Paris who don't know any better don't like it. And it ends up causing brawls. And one of the things that Bricktop, who knew him well, said was that he had a temper that flashed white hot in a split second when it came to race. And he did not hesitate to use his fists, nor did the guys around him, because he had a large white boxer by the name of Blink McCluskey, who was actually a Jewish fellow who had changed his name. And these guys loved nothing more than to beat the daylights out of people who gave Bullard trouble, and Bullard enjoyed it too. So there'll occasionally be brawls in the street, but he's got a booming business. The Depression kind of wrecks that. And at the same time, he's able to keep on going. A lot of people go under, but the threat starting in the mid-30s, and he'd actually been worried about the Germans coming again, even after World War I. And by the 1930s, the German threat is arising again, and he's not planning to go anywhere. He's in France, and he plans to stay there.
So once again, the Roaring '20s, but we have a historically aware audience, and everyone knows the '30s. Unfortunately, we're not so roaring. Rise of dictatorships. France itself comes close to a right-wing coup in 1934 that almost installs a kind of fascist dictatorship there. Hitler on the rise, Mussolini on the other border. But again, this is a man now who is wedded to the notion of French liberté and the French Republic. And storm clouds on the horizon, he does his duty again, doesn't he, John?
Oh, a lot of the Americans, when the storm clouds arose, decided that, especially as 1939 rolls around, this is not a safe place to be. But not Bullard. Josephine Baker actually had given up her American citizenship. Bullard was an American citizen by birth, but had no documents. But that doesn't bother him. And by 1939, he's still running his club and the French, what's called the Deuxième Bureau, the second bureau agency, which is French intelligence, French counterintelligence, approaches him and says, "You're running this great club. You got all these Germans who like to come in there too," which is true. There are about 17,000 Germans living in Paris, and they're probably all Nazi spies, but he caters to anyone. And the representative of the Deuxième Bureau, a French policeman, asked him, would he kind of get in good with the Germans, as he understands, he speaks German, and he puts him together with a French intelligence agent, Cléopâtre Terrier, and they pair up in his club. She behaves seductively and pretends she doesn't understand, but she speaks French, German, and English, and he can do the same thing. And they end up, as he said, he's a member of the resistance. He's actually working for the French Secret Service, which ironically gets him shot again, but this time by a French Corsican gangster who thought that Bullard was a collaborator with the Germans already, and shoots him in the gut with a Luger. And I think you begin to get this feeling about Bullard. He's too hard to kill, because Bullard almost got the pistol away from him. He closed with him. He gets hit in the stomach, but that doesn't stop him from calling for a bottle. Because one of his guys throws him this champagne bottles, and he smashes the guy Peretti over the head. Basically made him blind in one eye, knocked him out. And they're carrying him off to the hospital, bleeding like a stuck pig. And he's fortunate. The bullet strikes no crucial place in his abdomen. And 10 days later, he's out of the hospital and back again. But
if I'm a film director right now, I'm saying, Professor Morrow, this is completely implausible.
Yeah, exactly. How can you get away with this? But
so he fights in World War II on behalf of the French Republic.
Yes, and this is what's so amazing. This is what's so amazing. He, after working in Paris in the club, he has to close the club down. And in 1940, when the Germans invade, he says, well, war again. He leaves his daughters with Cléopâtre Terrier. She promises to take care of him. He grabs his old gear. He even has his old rifle. And off he goes to the Eastern Front, heading for Chateau Thierry, walking. And he's joined by these other members. It turns out they're all fought in the 170th in World War I. But by the time they get to Chateau Thierry, the war has moved on beyond them. France is losing so rapidly, so he can't even get back into Paris. So he hears, oh, okay, there's fighting down in the south of France, near Orléans. So they walk down there. Now, these are hundreds of miles. I mean, we're not talking, these guys are just hoofing it all over France. And he gets to Orléans, and he finds this 50th First Division fighting there, and he joins up. And it turns out when he gets there, he encounters men who were officers in the 170th, who are now senior officers in the 51st. And they say, Oh, you're back. Yes, I am. I'm ready to fight. Well, you manned a machine gun in World War One. We've got a machine gun unit right outside town. Go out and man that. He heads out to man the machine gun unit out there. But the Germans make very quick work of him. And this time he gets wounded again. A shell blows him 40 feet through the air and slams him against the stucco building. If he'd hit head first, he would have been dead, but no. He just has a shattered vertebrae and a bad shoulder, and he's in absolute agony. His spine has been twisted out of place. And so off when he gets to Orléans, the hospital looks at him and says, well, you really can't stay here. You're an American. You got to get out of here. Get to Biarritz, which is on the French border with Spain. So he starts walking. They bandage him up real tight. They give him some painkillers. Fortunately, some people feel sorry for him. He half hoofs it, then gets some rides, gets to Biarritz. They say there, do you have an American passport? Well, no. My only documents are French. But I did come from Columbus. So they said, well, you're going to go back to the consul general. And so he has to go all the way back 150 miles to Bordeaux. And the consul general there, and he encounters once again an American doctor, dentist he knew. All these men, they can vouch for him. So he gets a passport for the first time in his life. He has an American passport, goes back to Biarritz, cycling and walking. He gets to the border, they're holding everyone up, and he notices at the border, by God, who is that Frenchman, the French officer there? It's another fellow he had fought with in the 170th. The fellow said, come on up here. So they have some bottles of wine, they drink, puts him right across the border. He gets through Spain, out through Portugal, sails back to the United States, 1940. The only thing he's got to wrap up is his daughters, but he has contacts the American State Department from the First World War, Ambassador Bullard, and he gets his daughters out by July 1941, and they settle in a small apartment in Spanish Harlem, 116th Street, Eastern New York City. And that's where he's going to spend the rest of his life, doing odd jobs, longshoreman. He'll sell perfumes for a time and end up working as an elevator operator in Rockefeller Center.
You know, this is an amazing American life, a hero, but a hero who had to actualize himself by leaving the country. He obviously had everything it takes to be a hero, but that path was not available to him inside America. John, would you say the story better known today? I understand there's a story about the statue that was put up to Eugene Bullard, a fight over its location. I understand you were involved in this process in some way. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah,
and then we'll probably kick it over to the audience.
Yeah, very good. This is sort of the end of it. Bullard, after the war, in 1954, he's invited back to France to be one of a very few men who will relight the flame of the unknown soldier under the Arc de Triomphe in France, which he burns eternally. In 1959, he will become a Knight of the French Legion of Honor, a treasured award any Frenchman would value. He receives that from the French Consul General, and then in 1960, Charles de Gaulle comes to New York from Washington, has this big celebration of the 7th Division Armory in New York City. Bullard is invited. De Gaulle, who was huge at 6'6", calls Bullard, singles him out, thanks him profusely for serving France, hugs him, and then Bullard said that was the greatest moment of his life. But within a year, he will be dead of intestinal cancer. He's buried in the French Veterans Cemetery in Flushing. The funny thing about the aftermath, and what you brought up, is that Bullard in 1994, in October, will be appointed a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. So I happen to have served on the French, what do we call them? There are a number of French folks, but it was for the centennial, the World War I centennial, and the Georgia Commission. I was a member of the Georgia Commission, an academic advisor to the National Commission. And the Georgia Commission had an Air Force colonel retired on it, an Army colonel retired on it, and an Army major. It's actually active. And the first thing the commission, this wasn't my idea, the Army colonel came in with it. He said, if we don't do anything else, we're going to build a monument to Eugene Bullard. Everybody say, that's a wonderful idea. So we set aside tens of thousands of dollars to do it. It was done. And then as it comes to the end, this discussion breaks out in one of the meetings. The Army officers suddenly say, well, you know, there's a little problem here. Bullard comes from Columbus, and that's where Fort Benning is. Benning didn't exist until 1918. They said, so shouldn't the statue go to Columbus? And the Air Force colonel, I'm friends with all these fellows, I think I stay out of this one. Air Force colonel said, not on your life. He ran away from Columbus because he hated it there and the racism there. He is an Air Force second lieutenant. That statue goes at Warner Robins Air Force Base, where we have an air museum. And that today is where the statue of Eugene Bullard stands. Immortalizing him forever.
What a great capper. It's where they put your statue that really counts. And that's a beautiful story about inter-service rivalry in the U.S. And
the other thing I should mention is that all these gentlemen are white. So it's like, oh, nobody wanted him then. Now everybody
wants him. At least in that sense, times have changed for the better, John.
Yeah.
We have a pile of questions in here, and we'll try to get through some of them. Let's try to kind of do them as quick hits. I will say some of the questions were comments complimenting you and complimenting the fact that we put on this story. People are really taken by the epic, as I will call it, the saga.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Of Eugene Bullard. So from Ron Silver, I hope to bring a group of students to Paris next year. Is there a particular place that is best for telling the story of Eugene Bullard? Would it be Montmartre?
I think most definitely. I've spent a lot of my time at Montmartre, which shouldn't make people think I'm a debauched character. I love to go up into Montmartre and sit up on the Mount Hill at Sacré-Cœur and look out over Paris, just relax. But yes, it would be Montmartre. And ironically, there is a statue, it's a smaller thing, but they actually have a display on Eugene Bullard in the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, as well as material on him in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. So yes, Montmartre would be the logical place because in many respects, he was at the center of all the swirl in those 20 years.
I love the way you put that, the swirl. That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, everybody's there. Royalty, Picasso, you name it. They're all in Montmartre and they're all in his club. And, it's just an amazing place to be.
So another good question, the question we always get asked as historians, John, from Tracy Sheridan. Where can I learn more about Bullard and his service? Is there a book published or other resource that allows me to fill in more gaps?
Historians should always come equipped for these kinds of
And have you come equipped, Professor Morrow?
All right. Could I recommend two books? One is by Craig Lloyd, who is a professor emeritus at Columbus State in Georgia, and is a man who traced Bullard, but it's entitled Eugene Bullard, but it's called Black Expatriate in Jazz Age Paris. So it actually concentrates a lot more on the expatriate time, which is a fascinating time. And you realize how many people Bullard knew. The other one I would recommend, which has his photo, is All Blood Runs Red. When he flew the SPAD in World War I, he put the lettering on the side of the SPAD, which said, "Tout sang qui coule est rouge," which means all blood which runs is red. All blood runs red. In other words, equality. And it's by Phil Keith, Keith, with Tom Clavin. The title is All Blood Runs Red, The Legendary Life of Eugene Bullard, Boxer, Pilot, Soldier, Spy.
That covers about half of his various personas.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's not bad. You probably said this, Trinity Abels, where is he buried? You said the French military?
Yeah, there's a cemetery for French veterans in Flushing, New York. He joined, there was a Fédération Française. These were people who supported France, de Gaulle's France, during World War II. He was an avid member of that as well as the American Legion. But he went to all their meetings and they continued even after World War II. So he was always involved. In many respects, I think he probably remained as much French as he was American. He always wore a beret. And I guess the ultimate irony, if I should mention this, is that in 1959, Eleanor Roosevelt, who had a little article, she wrote weekly for papers, wrote after Bullard was given the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, she actually wrote this blurb on this black man, son of slaves, who was just admitted to the Legion of Honor. And at that point in time, Bullard was an elevator man in the Rockefeller Center building where Dave Garroway, people who remember him, hosted the Today Show. Yeah. And Garroway had noticed this fellow who was running the elevators, but he spoke to him, but he didn't think anything about it. He did notice he had these kind of medals, and we just figured, oh, well, they're probably associations. And then the day after he reads the article, Garroway looks at, and he takes another look at the fellow. He said, "Excuse me, where did you get that medal?" And that's when Bullard tells him it's the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. He said, "Oh my God." Then he realizes, oh, that's who Eleanor Roosevelt was talking about. So they had him on the Today Show with all 14 of his French decorations next to him, this little African-American man wearing glasses. He looks as sedate and mild as you can imagine. But here he is, and here are all these medals. And so in many respects, many years later, he at least lived to be recognized in the United States, which he had not been. The unfortunate thing is that there's actually a memorial to the Lafayette Flying Corps in France that was done in 1928 outside Paris. But Edmond Gross, the doctor, made certain that Bullard's name was not on it.
There's not a question, but a comment from Genevieve McGillicuddy, who said, "Great presentation. Thank you so much." I think she's speaking on behalf of everyone who heard it. One last question, and then we'll say goodbye. It's from our friend here at Xavier University in New Orleans, Marcus Cox. Dr. Morrow, this is an amazing story. Did Eugene Bullard, excuse me, I just lost the, there we go. Did Eugene Bullard meet or interact with African-American soldiers of the 369th Infantry Regiment in France?
It's an excellent question, and the answer would have to be no, because the 369th, which is the famous Harlem Hellfighters or Harlem Rappers, spent its time at the front. The average African-American soldier never got to Paris. They were never given leave to get to Paris. They went to the front. And in the case of the 369th, at the end of the war, they were shipped back immediately the harbor of Brest to be sent back to the United States. They were not even left in France to participate in the July 14th, 1919 memorial parade, in which every country paraded all of its soldiers, regardless of color, except for the United States, which excluded all of its troops of color. So Bullard would never have encountered them. Interestingly enough, in World War II at the beginning, when the Tuskegee Airmen were just forming up, he wrote to the rector of Tuskegee Institute and offered his services, but nobody had heard of him, so the fellow probably thought it was a crank. It's just because he received no publicity in the States. It was all in France that no one actually knew this phenomenal character existed. So either black or white.
On that note, I think we're going to have to call this marvelous session to an end. And I'm for one, I'm very sad that Eugene Bullard was not accepted into the Tuskegee Airmen. I think that would be another whole.
It would have been interesting.
That'd be another hour. We could talk about that for another hour.
It would be.
John, I'm speaking on behalf of folks here at the museum, but everyone who took part in the session today. What a marvelous historian and storyteller you are, and what an incredible subject for your considerable talent. So thanks for sharing this with us.
Thanks, Rob. It's an incredible story.
Please do, all folks in the audience, please be sure and tune in and see what the museum has cooking all through February for Black History Month, but all 12 months of the year are American History Month, and we promise to give the most diverse set of stories we possibly can going forward. So one more time for John Morrow. Thank you so much, John, and goodbye from the National World War II Museum.
My pleasure.